In this geometry ACT math problem, we're going to look at midpoints and endpoints. And this is the problem we're going to look at. So on an XY coordinate graph, segment AB has its midpoint located at -1, 4. If the coordinates of point A is 3, -2, what are the coordinates of point B? So this type of problem shows up often on the ACT, where you're given the midpoint of a segment, you're given one of the endpoints of the segment, and you have to go find the other endpoint. So at this point, you can stop the video and try to solve it on your own, or you can keep going and we'll work into getting the solution. Believe it or not, there's actually 3 different methods we can use to find this other endpoint. So we're going to go through each method separately. We're going to do it by counting steps. The next way we're going to use equations, and then we're going to use the answer choices to get the correct answer. The first way to solve the problem is to count steps. In other words, you use the number of steps it takes to get from point A to the midpoint and use those same number of steps to get from the midpoint to point B. Let's start with the x coordinates. So we need to get from point A to point M. So in other words, we need to get from 3 to -1. And it looks like to do that, we're going to have to take that x and subtract by 4, since 3 minus 4 will get us to -1. So that means I'm going to have to also subtract 4 by the x's to get from the midpoint to point B. And if we do that, that's going to be -1 minus 4, and that's going to give us -5. So in other words, the x coordinate is -5 for point B. Now let's look at the y values. So once again, we've got to get from point A to the midpoint. So in other words, we've got to go from -2 to 4. And it looks like for the y's, looks like we're going to have to add 6, because -2 plus 6 will arrive us at 4. So that means I'm going to have to use the same steps to get to point B. I'm going to have to add 6 to the y. So that's going to be 4 plus 6, and that gives you 10. So in other words, the y coordinate for point B is 10. Combining both answers, it looks like point B is going to have the coordinates -5, 10. The answer is D. So what you see here is a pictorial view of our problem. So you can see that the amount of steps it takes to get from point A to the midpoint are the same number of steps it takes to get from the midpoint to point B. And you can see how if we subtract 4 to the x from point A to the midpoint, you got to do the same to get from the midpoint to point B. And also if you add 6 to the y's to get from A to point M, you got to do the same thing to get to point B. So now we've shown it using math and using pictures that point B is located at -5, 10. The second way to solve this problem is to use the midpoint formula to create equations to find the coordinates of point B. We're going to let point A be 3, -2. We don't know what the coordinates of point B are, so we're just going to call them XY. And we're going to let our midpoint be the coordinates -1, 4. So using the midpoint formula, we have to add the x's and divide by 2 to get the x coordinate. In other words, adding the x coordinates of point A and point B and dividing by 2, that should give us an answer of -1 for the x coordinate for the midpoint. Adding the y coordinates and dividing by 2, that has to give us the y coordinate for the midpoint. We can now make 2 different equations. For the x values, we know that x plus 3 over 2 has to equal -1. And for the y values, we know that y plus -2 over 2 has to equal 4. Solving the first equation, I can multiply by 2 on both sides so that the 2's will cancel. That'll give me x plus 3 is equal to -2. And then bringing the 3 over, we end up with x is equaling -5. So now we know the x coordinate of point B is -5. I'm going to solve the second equation slightly differently, but just keep in mind that we can actually solve this equation the same exact way as we did to get x. So the approach I'm going to use for this one, I'm going to go ahead and just write it over 1 and cross multiply. And so this is going to be 1 times y plus -2 has to be equal to 2 times 4. So the left side is just going to be y plus -2. If you distribute the 1, it's just going to be the same thing as before, equals 8. And then to cancel out -2, I'll have to add 2 to both sides. You're going to end up with y is equaling 10. So it looks like point B, combining both answers, its coordinates is going to be -5, 10. Once again, the answer is D. Now let's look at the third way. So you can use the answer choices to get the correct coordinates of point B. What you do is you let point B be each of the answer choices, and then you work out the midpoint formula until you end up with the correct midpoint of -1,4. So what I've done here is we're already given point A, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by letting point B equal -4,2, and we're going to calculate the midpoint. So with point A being 3, -2, and with point B being -4,2, the midpoint with those is going to end up being 3 plus -4 over 2, and -2 plus 2 over 2. Calculating that, you're going to end up with -1/2 and 0 over 2. And so that's going to give you -0.50. That is not the correct midpoint, so we know that one's wrong. Using point A and now -4,6, we will end up with a midpoint of 3 plus -4 over 2, and -2 plus 6 over 2. I'm going to end up with -1 over 2, and 4 over 2. So the coordinates of this one is going to be -0.5 and 2. That also is not a midpoint of -1,4, so we know this one's wrong too. Now using point A and letting point B be -5, 6, you're going to end up with a midpoint of, let's see, that's going to be 3 plus -5 over 2, and -2 plus 6 over 2 for the y's. That's going to give us -2 over 2 for the x's, 4 over 2 for the y's. That's going to give us coordinates of -1, 2. That's not the midpoint of -1,4, so we know this one's wrong. Now let's try point A being 3, -2, and point B being -5, 10. Calculating the midpoint, you're going to end up with 3 plus -5 over 2, and -2 plus 10 over 2. Working that out, you're going to end up with -2 over 2, and 8 over 2. And it does look like you're going to get the correct midpoint of -1,4. So it looks like when point B is -5, 10, you will get the correct midpoint. Therefore, the correct answer is D. Go ahead and visit mathonthefly.com, where we have over 100 ACT math worksheets that cover a variety of topics. And while you're at it, go ahead and join our mailing list for updates. And we also offer an ACT math book that's in paperback form on Amazon, and is also available in PDF form. I hope you liked the video, and I'll see you in the next video.